Well, welcome everyone to the fourth annual geology lecture given by Sally Green for CPRE, Shropshire. I'm Charles Green, one of the trustees of CPRE Shropshire, and I'll be handing over to her soon. You can find her previous three lectures on YouTube simply by Googling Sally Green Geology, and up they all pop. Many of you are members of CPRE, but for those of you who aren't, and who aren't wholly familiar with us, we are the Countryside Charity, registered as the Campaign to Protect Rural England. And we've been going for nearly 100 years, as Sally will mention. We are the only national charity at the interface of nature, farming, the environment, landscape, and planning. Traditionally, we've lobbied for sensible planning policies, both at a national level with paid staff and here in the county branches at a local level, mainly via volunteers. Many of you will know that we in Shropshire have also been running a very successful Hedgerow Heroes project for the last 3 years, funded through national CPRE. And we've just finished planting over 8 kilometres of hedges and running a whole series of hedgerow-related courses and events. When I say we, it's all masterminded by our branch manager, Sarah Jameson, though she's may or may not be logged in tonight. She has to tutor me in Zoom hosting before she went on holiday. Can I also just mention our forthcoming CPRE Shropshire AGM, which will be held on Wednesday, 26th of June at the Bucketree Hall Hotel near the Wrekin. It's close by a Shropshire Wildlife Trust nature reserve and a famous geological site. And Sally and an ecologist will talk about both of those and lead a short walk to them. If that sounds of interest to non-CPRE members, please contact us via the website, details of which will be shown later. This lecture is free, but we would of course be grateful for any donations, which you can make via our website and the Just Giving button on its front page. There'll be a reminder of that at the end of the lecture. But now over to Sally.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for listening to this, my fourth geology lecture, given on behalf of CPRE Shropshire. Let's start. Okay.
Just started.
Oh, I want the picture.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'll start by saying William Morris was well known to have declared, "Have nothing in your house you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." What's less well known is that he also said, "If any regard is to be held to the general beauty of the landscape, the natural material of the special countryside should be used in preference to imported materials." This was said in 1890 by probably the greatest aesthete we've ever known, who abhorred the damage being wrought to the landscape and to villages, towns, and cities by mass production and industrialization. Morris was the leader of a flourishing movement, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and later the Arts and Crafts movement, and many others recognized the dangers of industrialization to the built and natural environment, and in their turn gave rise to other conservation organizations, such as the National Trust in 1895, and a generation later, the CPRE in 1926. So we're coming up for our centenary, initiated by a planner, Sir Patrick Abercrombie, worried about the spread of ribbon development around towns and cities by unplanned urban sprawl. Pollution was a great problem in the age of coal fires and coal-powered industry. We're paying the price now with global warming. On the left here, you see Octavia Hill, who was one of the founders of the National Trust. There were a number of people who got together and realised that a lot of our built environment was in danger. And thought up the National Trust. Next. Morris's country house at Kelmscott on the Upper Thames on the edge of the Cotswolds serves to illustrate this tenet. It seems to grow from the Jurassic soils and the surrounding tranquil countryside among the willows by the Upper Thames is stuffed full of arts and crafts furniture. A delight to behold. I was a frequent visitor in my youth as I grew up very close to this wonderful building. And I took my own children on free Wednesdays when it was open to immerse them in these declarations. CPRE, though not founded until some 30 years later, is built on these very same declarations, which we aim to instill in modern planners and architects where possible. Always use local materials where possible. And we all know that cities, towns and villages built from local materials hewn from nearby quarried stone, generally in the great age of house building, tend to be much more beautiful, visited and feted by all. Think of Bath. Here we are as Bath on the top right, with its uniform Georgian housing, planned and built of local oolitic limestone, which grows out of the surrounding hillsides, quarried very close to Bath. Oxford and Cambridge, of course, both lie just south of the belt of Jurassic limestones, both likewise built from their excellent freestone quarries in the belt of some 20 miles south from the limestone quarries. Cambridge from stone from the Peterborough, Grantham and Stamford areas a few miles north. Next. Welsh vernacular is generally stone built with slate roofs, as are the Lake District, mainly built of the same ancient rock type. Other notable stone-built cities include Aberdeen, as you see bottom left, which in fact we've just visited this last week, and also Peterhead, just up the coast, which is built of a beautiful red granite. Aberdeen is a hard grey granite quarried within the city, and it gives it its famous dour look. Maybe it needs to be dour at the moment, as we've just lost its first minister again. Yorkshire cities, likewise, such as the spa resort of Harrogate, is typical of a town built of York stone, a carboniferous sandstone associated with the coal belts. Many of these cities and villages were badly polluted during the industrial age of Victorian Britain and retain their dark satanic look, Manchester and Leeds being prime examples. Generally, however, most British cities are mainly built from brick, made from the abundant clays freely available everywhere. And indeed, if one thinks of the Shropshire vernacular, it's the brick-built farm buildings with their decorative patterns and widespread use of timber, infilled with plaster or stucco-covered rubble, which predominates. The stone is often hidden away and not made much of. But as you will see, the varied rocks of Shropshire do contribute to the special character of many Shropshire buildings being freely available, and the county has an abundance of quarries, new and redundant. Man, of course, had used locally available materials to build with. In this county, as elsewhere, early man built round stone houses covered in thatch from the days of first settlement. And monumental monoliths were erected to mark territory of tribes and perform rituals and determine the seasons and show status. We have a number of stone circles, such as Mitchell's Fold, near Priest Weston, built of local volcanic rocks, abundant nearby in the Stapley Hills. Much of Britain was far more wooded in the Neolithic times, and the availability of suitable rock before the use of metal for making axes and hammers was a vital industry for felling and working the timber, so far from the flint mines of Norfolk. The perfect stone was discovered near Hissington, just under Corndon Hill, a rare igneous rock called pickrite, which is not only hard, but workable and a beautiful blue-green colour from the olivine it contains. Excavations recently unearthed a large factory and specimens have turned up all over the country. So they were used as trade goods and therefore highly valuable at the time. Go back one, please. In general, hill forts in the marches were built from the local soils on hilltops, though it's likely that many of the ramparts and reinforced with rocks, indeed, were reinforced with rocks. Indeed, in some places, we find vitrified forts where the rocks were fused for strength using fire set next to the rocks. But as time went on, for fortification, wooden structures gave way to stone-built ones for strength and dominance. The Romans came to Britain with a good knowledge of stoneworking and used local materials, shaping columns and making statues. They also built many roads, often adopting previous Iron Age roads, using rock for strength, a process now well researched and documented after excavations. Here we have our Roman Shropshire. Later, of course, the Marcher lords built their castles on prominent sites, tending to use the best local stone, and thousands were employed as slave labour to build these massive structures in the Middle Ages. Here we have Ludlow, built among the Silurian shales. Oswestry, oh no, it's not shown. Clun, Whittington, numerous castles, all using their very local stones. So if you want to come and see the building stones of Shropshire, you're best possibly to come and look at our medieval castles, most of which, of course, are ruined. Hundreds must have been employed in this endeavour, and skill in stonemasonry developed is evident in ecclesiastical buildings. They learned how to use different rocks for different parts of the buildings according to the use, such as ashlar, shaping of windows and arrow slits. Next, abbeys abounded in Shropshire and were built from the local stones again. When they were dissolved by Henry VIII, the building stones were usually reused by local dignitaries who had acquired the land and were building their mansions, such as Wilderhope Manor. Other buildings generally built for stone in the county are the churches. We do have a few famous wooden churches, like Melverley and latterly off-the-shelf corrugated iron structures, Maysbury nearby, but almost any other church will be made of stone. In some cases, these stone churches have not stood the test of time and erode if the stone is soft. A good example being, if you go to West Felton Church in the west of the county, you will see that erosion of the local new red sandstone is well advanced, and in places there must be danger of complete disintegration. As I travelled around the country looking at stone buildings, I was struck by the wealth of walls we have. Usually, the best way to see the local geology. For instance, as you drive from Acton Scott to Cumley, you traverse a number of changes in the geology and the walls noticeably changed, of which more later. So here's an example of the various different walls in Shropshire, and you see how varied they are. The one in the middle top is between Acton Scott and well, the one coming south, and there are 3 or 4 different building stones used in this wall, reflecting the changes in the local depth of the sea in Silurian age and Ordovician age. So what makes a good building stone? Here's a list of the factors conspiring to make a durable, workable stone. And in general, the older the rock, the harder and more difficult to work. Not an absolute rule, but it's in general. Younger rocks have spent less time being concreted and solidified, and they're generally more workable. The type of ingredients make for durability. We have old and younger deposit limestones, notably Silurian on Wenlock Edge, and Carboniferous in the Oswestry Hills, and a small outcrop of Liassic round Wem, which hasn't really solidified enough to be used, so you won't find any buildings, just yellow soils. We have sandstones in abundance from old and new red sandstone deposits. Kefnifedu in the west, a much used and prized Carboniferous sandstone associated with coal seams. And a good workable rock must be workable in all planes. It's called a freestone. Many sedimentary rocks are stratified and split along planes, but still used as layered building stones. The science of stonemasonry is complex, and over many years, instruments and methods have been devised to aid in working stones. Quarrymen over centuries have tended to extract large quantities of rough stone for facing using laterally high explosives, then gradually reduce the pieces of and shaping of rocks by boring holes in the plane desired, ramming wedges into these until the stone splits. This, of course, a great art in perfecting these methods. Monumental stonemasons learnt these methods in their apprenticeships and become very skilled at hewing the shapes they wish for. But as we know, most rock these days is dug up to make aggregates, crushed rocks, all done mechanically on site in preparation for use in roadstone, concrete, building sites of all sorts. Sadly, stonemasonry is a very minority profession these days, sadly. Right, quarries. First of all, I want to point out that quarries are very dangerous places. So I often encounter barriers to my explorations. Hardly a year goes by without news that someone's drowned in an old quarry. The water is often very deep, cold, with hidden rock shells waiting to catch you if you dive in. So always get permission if the quarry is clearly privately owned, and always go with someone else and a method of communication. Shropshire, having very varied geology. Oh, here is some, it's very rich in quarries. I managed to visit a good number during these winter months, including several working quarries, the majority of which produce aggregates, sand, gravel, and other materials for use in the building industry. No doubt contributing well to local economies. I imagine one of our large quarries is currently busy supplying British Rail with rocks to shore up the collapsed railway embankment, which failed recently in the wet weather. Well, it's now repaired. And luckily, it's very near to the Leighton Quarry near Wellington. And there's a direct rail link with Sharpstone Quarry. So I don't know, but I think it's likely they got their rocks for shoring up the bank from these quarries. Now I want to refresh your memories about the geology of Shropshire. Here are the quarries. On the left are the working quarries, which are quite numerous. But on the right, you see disused quarries of any size. I mean, every village will have had a quarry, probably. So there are far fewer quarries, but there's still quite a number producing aggregates, sand and gravel, which is a big one, building stones, very, very few, but some are, and lime. The limestone is still in some places burned to produce agricultural lime, lime mortar, other uses for lime. Right, and sometimes we in Shropshire, we have to look at quarries from other parts, other counties, and this is a picture from just north of the River Vyrnwy, very close to where we live, looking at Criggan Quarry on the side of the Brythen Hill, which is made from a very beautiful blue flecked igneous rock. Which is absolutely beautiful, but it's rapidly being quarried. The whole hill is being quarried away. We're hoping that the Welsh, as it's in Powys, will have a limit to how much of this rock can be taken. Otherwise, the entire hill will disappear. But as you see, it's a huge scar on the landscape, and something that CPRE Shropshire is somewhat concerned about, but we're not sure we can do anything about it. Right, and here again is Lannamonakill, half of which is in Wales, but this great scar on the landscape looking north from the same point as the previous one demonstrates the, first of all, you can see the tip of the landscape very clearly here, but the face of limestone is all part of an enormous quarry, which was a very, very busy working quarry until relatively recently, with its associated kilns and railways and canals and so forth. Right. Oh, this is I'm going to pass over to my sidekick now, because he's the planning man for Shropshire CPRE and knows all about mineral safeguarding.
This slide is just here just to show that minerals and quarrying are still an important part of the planning process. Currently Shropshire Council are going through a local plan review, and this is their map showing what's called mineral safeguarding. So you can see the coloured areas are areas of building stone, coal, crushed rock, sand and gravel, etc. And those are still useful resources for the building industry. So the Shropshire Council makes sure that those areas are what's called safeguarded. So they try and make sure that they're not built over, so that they're still available. And there's a whole there were 3 inspectors involved in the local plan review, which is currently stalled for various reasons, but one of those is a specialist mineral inspector. That is the importance of minerals to the county of Shropshire and all other counties. All counties have to do this. All local authorities have to make sure they have this mineral safeguarding. Okay, back to Sally.
Okay, now to revise the geology of Shropshire. Now, I hope many of you will have seen my first YouTube video explaining the geological history of Shropshire, which is immensely complicated. I can't go into all that detail now, but as you know, the Shropshire actually has almost every era of rocks, bar anything after Lower Jurassic, which have either been eroded off or were never laid down. It's not really been determined. The vast majority of time the Earth's been evolving encompass the first 4.5 billion years. We've just come back from a geology holiday with the legendary Chris Darman in Assynt in northwest Scotland, where rocks there are 3 billion years old, which is unimaginably old. Well, we can in no way match that in Shropshire, but we do have some pretty old rocks. And our earliest rocks, the Rushton schists, just west of the Wrekin, date about 670 million years old, and is part of the Midland Craton, which is the basement rocks of the whole of the Midlands. So such rocks can be found near Malvern, for instance, that underlie all the rocks in this part of the world, probably. This is a big block of rock, ancient rock, that probably moved round together as the continents moved, crashed together and moved round and then parted again. It's exposed in a very small patch around Rushton, just by the Wrekin, and is far too hard to be employed as a building stone and is not really exposed. And the best of my knowledge has never been worked for any other purpose. Now, as you look at the map, you see there's this giant split which bisects what is now Shropshire, the famous Church Stretton Fault, which extends way up towards Stoke-on-Trent and down to southwest Wales, which is a line of instability in the crust, which has actually moved a bit like the San Andreas Fault laterally over millions of years. and has many branches, including the Ponsford-Linley fault, um, uh, which and these gashes hosted the rise of magma in Euraconian times, not unlike what is happening now in Iceland, through which the Euraconian hills, the famous hills in near Church Stretton, erupted between 570 and 560 million years ago. And the tear remains as an active boundary for millions of years. Indeed, remains active, producing occasional earthquakes. Not big, but there was one in the 1980s that shook a few chimneys down. The Euraconian line of hills marks this boundary and was for millions of years the edge of the continent with a shifting shoreline. So it's this marine influence which allowed the sediments forming what would ultimately become the building stones, sometimes shallow and sometimes deeper, where terrestrial debris accumulated and eventually solidified, sometimes lying in deeper seas where muds and sand accumulated. When the seas were shallow, corals, such as we see in the Barrier Reef, developed, eventually gave rise to limestones. All these are well represented in Shropshire, and a large number of distinctly different rock types resulted and have been used by man. Rocks formed by the Euraconian volcanoes are generally hard and difficult to work, else not much used for building, but are found in walls near the fault and in places more commonly. So we're here we have the situation of the world. I'm sure everybody knows that by now about plate tectonics and how the continents have moved around the globe, sometimes breaking off from one another, sometimes crashing together by a process of what we call subduction, form really powered by convection currents in the Earth's mantle. So this was the situation in the late Precambrian, and you'll see a little red dot which marks where Shropshire was at that time. And the cross is actually the South Pole. So as you see, we were rather close to the South Pole. The Euraconian volcanoes erupted through the ancient basement rocks on the edge of a supercontinent called Rodinia. Life developed fairly early in the 4.5 million years, but for 3 billion years was very, very simple unicellular life. And in the picture to the right, you see these rounded, clumpy things. These are called stromatolites, and they're where sort of unicellular algal life developed. And in fact, we've been looking at this in northwest Scotland, some very, very old red stripes, really, which are now thought to be algae, extremely old. And there we were down in the south, very, very a cold environment. Now, these next please, next. These Precambrian rocks, which you see marked here, the volcanoes rapidly eroded with the same forces we have now: erosion, heat and cold and rain and water, and deposited a large amount of debris between the Ponsford-Linley fault and the Church Stretton fault, which eventually became Longmindian rocks, which are regarded as sedimentary rocks, but they're very hard because they're formed largely of these volcanic rocks. And later on, this was, I have a picture of them. For people from outside Shropshire, this forms the most wonderful landscape where we have the Longmind, which is very folded. Later on, this area of debris was squashed up and formed into a syncline. And here we're looking down the line of the Uriconian volcanoes, which are so prominent. As I say, I call them volcanoes, but they're like what's happening in Iceland now. They're linear fissure volcanoes. There's the Wrekin, and nearby we have this is, I think, the Lawley, and they form our wonderful landscape. Now, for millions, they marked the boundary, and for millions of years were the edge of the continent. So anything to the west and north of this was a shoreline for millions of years, which became gradually deeper and deeper as you went west. And the whole of Wales is, in fact, a large basin which filled up with sediment and was very, very deep and has what we call turbidites, where sort of landslides came, or sea slides, deposited rocks at the bottom of the sea, which you can see in the cliffs at Aberystwyth. To the east of that line, the seas were much, much shallower for much of geological history. And sometimes it was actually dry. So we'll talk about that a bit later. Now, if we do have quarries that exploit these ancient rocks, and in fact, if you're looking for a thrill, this is one to go and visit probably on a Sunday when it's not working, which is when I went. The Sharpstone Quarry, just south of Shrewsbury, works these very, very hard, ancient, what we call Longmindian rocks. And they've actually taken the quarry down below sea level. So that shows how enormous it is. I've spoken to people who have lived in Baston Hill nearby all their life and say, well, when we were children, this was just a ridge, but they got quarrying in the early part of of last century, and now there's just a huge gaping hole, and there's a huge appetite for these rocks, so they're being chewed away at enormous rate. And a branch of the railway that goes south from Shrewsbury carries it away by rail. Next. These are the elaborate works for crushing this stuff up and feeding it straight onto the railway line. This is another quarry in the Uriconian rocks at Horman, just to the west of Shrewsbury. Not quite as deep, but fairly impressive nonetheless, and being worked as at the moment. Next. And Leighton Quarry. This actually quarries the actual Precambrian rock itself, the dolerite. As you whiz along the M54 between Shrewsbury and Telford, well, actually just before the M54, you are quite unaware of the fact that on your left you are passing this extremely deep quarry, which is a working quarry, which is working. It had to take, if you look at the top right, it takes off the overburden. At this area, the exposed rocks are Triassic sandstones, or keel beds as we call them, which are red. But once you're through that, you're onto the bedrock. And you'll be aware that there are these hard rocks in this area as you go through a cutting on the just before the M54 starts on the A5, where there's a cutting of very bright red rocks, which is rhyolite, which is a volcanic lava, basically solidified. So here's Leighton Quarry, which I say is a working quarry. And there's another one which you can visit that hasn't been worked recently at Forest Glen, which is in the gap between the Wrekin and the Urkel, There's a road that pushes through to Little Wenlock from Wellington. And this is a quarry in these ancient volcanic rocks that form the Wrekin and the Urkel. And here are some of the walls made from these dark, rather unworkable volcanic rocks. The one on the left is in a farm just underneath the Lawley, and on the right it's a wall going up the Burway. If you are aware of the wonderful road up to the Longmynd, you'll see these rocks. Okay, then we move into the Cambrian area. Cambrian rocks are confined to a very small area adjacent to the Church Stretton Fault. And famously, the Victorian geologist Murchison and Sedgwick discovered some early trilobites in the Cumney Quarry, where early Cambrian shales are exposed. And this is where the first complex life was found as fossils. So here are some rather wonderful pictures. They don't encourage you to go into this quarry, which is a little unremarkable and hasn't really been looked after properly, but it is extremely famous in geological terms. During the Cambrian era, just go back one.
Yeah.
This area, this Avalonia, which carries what became southern England, was breaking away from a large landmass. And it's thought that the evolution of complex life happened because a lot more shorelines developed at this time. The continents were breaking up, providing a lot more shallow seas, which produced shoreline deposits. So the two parts of Britain were very widely spaced at this era. As you see, what it became Scotland was carried on the edge of a continent called Laurentia, which eventually became North America. But we're still about 60 degrees south in latitude, but slowly moving north as a large open ocean we crossed and called the Iapetus Ocean, about which more. These are examples of the Burgess Shale, which are these bizarre complex life, which was found in northwest Canada, and in fact replicated in places in China and elsewhere since it was discovered, showing this explosion of life. Okay, so in Shropshire we have the Urkel volcanics. At the Urkel quarry, there's what we call an unconformity. There's a sudden jump from Precambrian volcanic rocks to Cambrian quartzites with a great age gap, which are shoreline deposits. They're just sandy beaches that have solidified, and it becomes this very hard rock called quartzite, hosted in a sedimentary rock called the Mitten Flags. Right, carry on. Next. All right, now we move on to the Ordovician, which is a very important era, 510 to 450 million years ago. A great deal was happening. It's generally known as the age of volcanism. And it was during the Ordovician that a lot of our building stones were laid down. Avalonia at this time is travelling north by subduction means across the Iapetus Ocean, which is narrowing, and another ocean is opening further south, the Rhyic Ocean. And we're still in the southern hemisphere, as is what will become Scotland, and around about 40 degrees south. In the late Ordovician, Britain actually docked with Baltica, which is the crustal block that contains Scandinavia and Western Siberia, well, Western Russia, really. and actually affected us to the point of producing the shelf anticline. The Welsh Basin at this time was underwater still, but filling with these sediments, and Shropshire. So the varying shoreline sediments in Shropshire. And we had a lot of island arc volcanism. If you think, oh, the Caribbean, Japan, the Indonesia, there was a lot of volcanoes happening in the sea, which produced a lot of ash and a lot of rock coming up from below. And towards the end of the Ordovician, there was another mass extinction because we had a huge ice age. So we see a lot of rich shoreline biota. There's a lot of life growing underwater. No land life at this stage, which later became our rocks. I'll move on to that. Move on. Okay. Now, Ordovician geology in Shropshire is very complicated, and I won't go into great detail, but we look at an area west of the Church Stretton Fault, the shelf area, which you see is kind of folded. This happened in later geological eras, but it was laid down horizontally. As you see with these reds, that's volcanic sections which have now become Stapley Hill with an intrusion of dolerites. And then a vast number of different layers of sedimentary rocks. To the west, they're the building stones that formed the Whittery Volcanics, which are right next to the Marrington Dingle. As you drive from Welshpool to Church Stoke, you see this enormous, great big gash to your right, to your left, which was deepened by the Ice Age, but it was filled with volcanic rocks. And Cherbury is built largely from these pale-coloured volcanics. And the most recognisable Cambrian rocks are the Stiper stones, which everybody knows, that form this ridge in the Ordovician ridge in the Shropshire Hills. Very hard quartzite, another quartzite. Next. Right, so there are a number of impressive quarries in these rocks. I discovered for the first time Pole's Coppice Quarry, which is just behind Pontesbury, but there's also Nils Hill. And these quarries contain the Mitten flags, which are in fact the sedimentary rocks which contain the later deposited minerals, which are exploited at Snail Beach, but they surround the Ordovician quartzites, which in the right-hand picture you see as the vertical slits here, which is quarried and used as a building stone in the Pontesbury area, despite being very, very hard. Nils Hill, bottom left, is a good example of the reuse of an ancient quarry. It's been restored over the last 20 years from a working quartzite quarry where they crushed a lot of this very hard rock. When it ceased to be needed, I don't think it was worked out, but when it perhaps went bust, it became a landfill site for some years. And when that was filled up, so to speak, it's been turned into a nature reserve, and now it's a very, very pleasant walk. So anybody local, I advise to go to Pontesbury and look up these two extremely interesting quarries. And on the right is a quarry at Priest Weston, which is on the west side of the shelf anticline, and somebody's bought it and turned it into a rather nice little sort of, I don't know what you call it, a homestead with an old bus and an old caravan and a few flags and wooden built shackery, rather picturesque. It's got a horseshoe for luck. So here we have the geological map of mainly the east of the Church Stretton Fault. The Church Stretton Fault goes through the line on the left. And as you see, many, many different rocks sort of squeeze their way up through this Church Stretton Fault. But to the right of the Church Stretton Fault, or the southeast, there is a series of different shallow water deposit rocks, which are one on top of the other, and they're tipped, all of which produce very fine working building stones until you hit the famous Church Stretton Fault, Wenlock Edge, which is a Silurian limestone, and the Amestree limestone just above it. So next one, please. Our good friend from the Shropshire Geology Society, David Pannett, drew a very detailed map of where all these different strati come out at the surface and what they're used for. So in general, they form a line of ribs. So if you stand on the top of the Lawley Hill, no, not the Lawley, the Caer Caradoc, and look northeast, you will see these, I will call them ribs, different edges. And each one, as you see above, marks the end of one of these layers of Ordovician rocks, laid down, as I say, horizontally, but through earth movement have become tilted, exposing their edges at the surface, and they're all very slightly different from one another. And all these rocks are suitable for building stones. So it's interrupted in the middle of the area by an outpouching of the Uriconian volcanics, which are generally in a line along the fault, but at this point they stick out into further east, the Hope Bowdler Hills. But either side of them, we have this complicated series of building what became building stones. And here you see in the far southeast corner of this map are the Wenlock limestones, which everybody knows about, really, who's visited Shropshire. And if you haven't, do come and see them. Next. So this just shows the various types of rocks east of the Church Stretton Fault that are Ordovician in origin. Cowan Church uses all these rocks for decoration. It's really very beautiful, as you see on the right. And the ones below actually is just a piece of tourist information, really, because I discovered this for the first time, the most amazing Langley Hall, which is actually a gatehouse, as you see from the large hole in it. A very typical medieval Shropshire homestead in timber. Very, very beautiful. It's nestled among all these ridges. And Langley Chapel, which is now closed, but is a tourist, it is marked, made of the local Chatwell sandstone. Very beautiful, very, very old chapel. I think it's Norman or something, or even Saxon. Next. Okay, I won't attempt to detail all these different building stones because it's extremely difficult to know. And when I went, I hadn't a clear idea in my head which was which. But there is, in fact, a publication called the Atlas of the Building Stone Atlas of Shropshire, which you can find on the internet, which goes into far more detail than I can. But suffice to say that if you drive from Acton Burnell up into these hills, you will see that the walls just gradually change and the building stones gradually change. So here we have Pitchford, which has a famous hall, roofed in what we call Harnage shales. One of the shales is, because it contains a lot of fossils, is easily cleaved into tiles. So it's roofed with these tiles and re-roofed recently, apparently. The Hoar Edge grit here, slightly reddish, gritty, that's found all along the top of the Hoar Edge, which is one of the first ribs. One on the bottom left is up for sale if anyone wants to buy it. And that morphs into the Chatwell Stand sandstone. This is a house in one of the valleys where the rocks were softer, so they were eroded away early. Next, please. And there's the sandstone with the flags mixed in a wall. The Chatwell Sandstone, and they are very fissile, we call it. They're very easily split. So there's a wall on the top of the Chatwell Ridge made of these flags. Here are some others, and all of them are visible in St Lawrence Church in Church Stretton, where they've mixed the local building stones. I'm sure there's much information there about the different ones. So these are the Harnage shales that form tiles. And here's a farm at Harnage, which I take it to mean that is Harnage. And there's something called the Horderley Sandstone. Actually, it is just west. No, it isn't. No, it's west of Church Stretton, but this is another sandstone further down near Craven Arms. And Cardington Church. And then there's the Soodley Sandstone, which is another discrete type of sandstone. But they all kind of merge into one another because this is very shallow seas that came and went, got deeper, got shallower. There was volcanism nearby, so they will have varying amounts of ash included in them. So it's a very complex, but the more you look, the more you found. I say I took 3 visits to even begin to sort out the differences, but well worth a visit. So, and here we have a limestone top right, which around Acton Scott Farm, the farm where we had our AGM last year, I think, which was open to the public. It's a working Victorian farm, sadly closed by Shropshire Council, but it's due to reopen, I think, this spring by a trust led by the family who live there. And this is all built on a plateau of Acton Scott stones, and there's quite a lot of lime in these. So there must have been coral reefs nearby in the Ordovician. So a lot of interesting stones in this area. Move on. Okay, but I could go on and on. Silurian followed by we were moving north. We were moving into warmer climes now. Let's say 20 degrees south, and the Iapetus Ocean has actually disappeared completely, gone, and we have banged into Scotland. The suture line is just south of the uplands, the Scottish lowlands. If you go to Carlisle, you're looking across to the part of Britain that was carried along by Laurentia. So we've fused, but another ocean is opening to the south, the Reich Ocean. It's widening. And this is the time the junction of these 2 continents formed Caledonian Mountains that stretch all the way from northern Norway to southeast America, because all these were one continent at that time. So the force of the meeting of these 3 continents produced extremely high mountains. This is the beginning of the Caledonian orogeny. And it's a time of reef building. So at this time, there were a lot of shallow seas. It was warm. So large coral reefs formed, of which Wenlock Edge is the most famous. But we have limey, muddy rocks in Clun Forest and the Long Mountain. And life was subtropical, so there were a lot of shells of various sorts and corals and brachiopods and bryozoans, etc., etc. and pioneer plants. They were beginning to make their way onto land. So the building stones now in the Silurian tend to be fairly limey. And these are the earliest ones. I was talking about these ribs to the southeast of the Church Stretton fault. Well, the first ones you come to in the Silurian era are the Kenley grits, and these are very easily recognised because they're very gritty. They're formed, therefore, from the start probably of the erosion of these newly formed mountains rushing down in rivers on dry land. So you get these grit stone evident in the buildings. Very, very easy to see. Next. The Silurian limestones formed the Wenlock Edge, which is very fossiliferous. And so if you go to much Wenlock, all the buildings practically are built of Silurian limestone. So here we have them mixed with some of the medieval timber work, but they're beginning to use the rocks a lot more. And Wenlock Edge hosts numerous quarries, many of which were exploited for their lime. So you will find a lot of disused lime kilns along Wenlock Edge if you drive along the road. Here at the bottom are two quarries. The Lee Quarry, large disused now quarry, some of which are flooded, but the nature authorities are making some very interesting walks along explaining all this. Next, please. So this is Knoll Quarry on Wenlock Edge, which has a walk pioneered through it, open to the public with a lot of explanation. And here is a typical older Wenlock Quarry, Knoll Quarry, where you can clearly see the layers of layer upon layer of deposits of this limey stuff in a coral reef. And here you see the bending round large concretions of life, really. And this was exploited for its lime content, and therefore the line of kilns nearby in the walk, which you see where they would have shoveled all this limestone. And below is an aerial view of the same area, showing some of the worked out quarries. Knoll Quarry is just at the bottom here. So again, very well worth a visit if you haven't been, and some wonderful buildings using the Wenlock limestones. Next. So the Silurian had many other types of rock, very notably the pentamorous rock. One stage during Silurian times, this little critter abounded on the seashore. It's called government rock because they're little shells called brachiopods, which more or less completely made the rock here. And as it sort of rotted, a web in the middle persisted and giving this kind of arrow shape, reminiscent of the clothes that prisoners wore in Victorian times, run by the government. So it becomes called government rock. And the villages of Norbury and Wentmore are probably the most growing out of the landscape that I've discovered in Shropshire, made of this pentamorous limestone. Fantastic stuff. And they are further west than Wenlock Edge. They're at the south end of the Shropshire Hills. Next. Another Silurian. When you get to Clun, that's further west, the water was deeper. The rocks are muddier. They're sort of darker grey, still full of fossils, but the whole of the Clun Forest area is made from this Silurian limestone, and actually some slightly younger rocks at the top of the Devonian. And here on the right is a quarry showing this Clun Forest rock. But I actually drove through here on Sunday on my way back from the Wonderwall show in Llandrindod, Wales, discovered that whole villages that do seem to grow out of the landscape in the Clun Forest area and further south. still in Shropshire, but right on the Welsh border. So places like Llanfair Waterdine, where most of the buildings are built from this very grey, dark grey, quite soft limestone. Okay, time goes on. There we are in the Devonian. By now, Shropshire is only 15 degrees south, still moving north, and now embedded in this giant continent of Laurentia. The continent below is closing, but the whole area is getting drier and drier, and it's more like a desert. So the giant Caledonian mountains, which were probably as high as the Himalayas now, were rapidly eroding. Very large rivers were rushing down from these great heights and laying down what we call the old red sandstone. And we have we sort of collate it with Devonian, but actually it's its own era, really. So everywhere from Greenland, Eastern America, here in Britain, we find these very, very red, iron-rich sandstones, which have come from the erosion of the Caledonian mountains. And just last week, we were up in Caithness at a very famous quarry called the Achnaharris Quarry, where fossil fish are found embedded in these old red sandstones. I have to say we didn't find any, but we had a nice time looking. So it was a very ubiquitous red. And we do have this in Shropshire. So life was beginning to crawl out of the water here, fish, coelacanths, and early land plants were beginning to colonize the land, which was warm and fairly hospitable, let's say. So, but we were on land, yeah. And a very famous quarry here is the Ludford Quarry, just outside Ludlow. If you cross the bridge at the bottom of the Ludlow main street, the very dominant Victorian, very self-assured geologist Murchison declared this to be where the Silurian-Devonian boundary happened. And actually he was later proved wrong, but this features a lot in his theses about the age of these rocks and the composition. So this quarry has become famous and it's marked, but it's a little bit unimpressive. In fact, no one's looking after it, which is terribly sad. All that vegetation needs taking off to show you the possible junction of the Silurian and the Devonian. Next. So old red sandstone, not used widely as a building stone in Shropshire, but if you go up the Brown Clee Hill, both the Clee Hills are composed of Devonian old red sandstones. You'll see buildings here on the left, which are very red looking. So here's one of the fishes that I didn't find, but I will next time in the Achnaharris Quarry. So they form the Clee Hills, I say. And now we move on to the Carboniferous, very, very important era. We're sitting practically on the equator at this time. The Reich Ocean has closed, and there is, when this closed, there was another, what we call orogeny, because of two large blocks colliding. We've produced the Hercynian orogeny. That's a line of mountains, the remnants of which you find in Devon and Cornwall, but stretch east to Germany. So, and another supercontinent, Pangaea, is forming. Now, of course, it's tropical. We're on the equator. And so there's abundant life in the shallow seas, forming the famous Carboniferous limestone, which we have plenty of. Once the limestone had settled around for many millions of years, rivers started depositing grits and depositional when rocks, and we form the Kefan stones, which are basically millstone grit that you see in the Peak District and the Pennines. upon which grew these amazing trees, these lycopodia, which weren't actually trees, they're almost giant grasses, really, and formed the number of coal fields in Shropshire. We have a coalfield in the Oswestry Hills, in Hanwood, Ironbridge, the Clee Hills, and the Wyre Forest. And at this time, the Mitten flags, remember those from the Cambrian, they were invaded by minerals, forming the zinc and the lead and the barium steam. But as for building stones, next please, there were a lot of quarries. So in the Carboniferous, we see a lot of quarrying in the limestone. So in our area of West Shropshire, we have the Lunkless limestone quarry, which is still active. I'm not quite sure what they use these limestones for, but I think they still do burn them for agricultural use. And the Nantmire quarry to the top right, which is disused. In fact, I think it's used for recreational motorbiking or something. But that produced, tons and tons and tons of lime. And below the disused quarry at Little Wenlock, I couldn't get into it to check, but at Little Wenlock you have volcanic rocks, basalts, very close to Carboniferous limestone. It's a complicated area, but I wasn't able to explore because it's closed to the public and is now used as a fishing lake. Fine. And to the left, on the top of the Titterston Clee, is this curious dewstone, which is a volcanic sill that intruded right into the Carboniferous limestone and coal seams right at the top of Titterston Clee, which produces a very moon-like quality to the landscapes, worth going visiting just to look at it because it's quite extraordinary. And that was quarried for a long time for sets for the Midland streets. Next. So here was Lanham. This is how the Carboniferous limestone is used in buildings. If you go to Lanhamonnock Village, I'm standing in Wales at this point, but the other side of the road is in England, so it qualified for the talk. It's in the extremity of Shropshire. And blocks of this limestone, they're cut up into, very laboriously, I expect, into building blocks. But everywhere in this area we see it in rubble stone walls, etc. Cefnifedu sandstones, which lie on top of the Carboniferous limestone, is a very, very good building stone. And in this area has been used to build these bridges. The pillars of the famous Ponxsyrthy Aqueduct are made of Cefnifedu, and Chirk Aqueduct and Llanybodwell Bridge here in that's just in Wales, actually. But this is a much used, is it? And very, very attractive sandstone. Next. Now, the Upper Carboniferous again, we find by the River Severn, Highley and Alveley, there was a very large quarry at Alveley, much used to make millstones, in fact. So you see these chaps here fashioning a millstone, because it's actually millstone grit. It's the same age of rocks as the famous millstone grits. And that's right by the River Severn. So it was all loaded, a lot of it was loaded onto the river on barges, moved downstream, and Worcester Cathedral has elements, I won't say it's all, but elements of the Highley sandstones and Alveley stones, which, as you see, are various colours. They're not all pale. Okay. So in the Permian, this giant continent, Pangaea, was it was basically most land was consumed in it, but it was a large desert area which will have had flash floods and sand dunes. and the basin in North Shropshire was filling with sands and marl stones. So most of North Shropshire is Permo-Triassic, we call it. And that's when the hills of Nestcliff, Grinshill and Hawkston, the line of hills north of Shrewsbury, were forming from these desert sandstones. Life was getting quite a hold, so we saw early reptiles in the Permian, rather bizarre creatures here. I like their look. I think that's a bit of artistic license here, but yes, the very early dinosaurs were evolving. But towards the end of the Permian, there was a mass extinction. I don't think anyone really knows why. 96% of mortality of marine life, and the trilobites disappeared, and a lot of the terrestrial life disappeared as well. But we are now in the northern hemisphere, moving north, and Permian rocks are often collated with the Triassic rocks. But here we have an unusual rock in Shropshire, which is quite a small area called the Permian Alberbury breccias. If you look carefully at this wall on the top right, you'll see this reddish stone contains a lot of white inclusions, so what we call a conglomerate. And these are actually the Carboniferous limestone, which abounds fairly near, it's still intact at Lannamonnock, all crushed up and being incorporated in the sands of the Permian. So it makes a rather attractive sort of pinky rock. It's used to build notably Albury Castle. And there's a small ridge if you go along the road from Four Crosses to Shrewsbury. You pass through this smallish outbreak of Albury rock. And Rowden Castle, goes swimming, is built of Albury breccia. We call it a breccia. Very attractive rock, much used by castle builders. Now we move into the Triassic, which is the new red sandstone. Again, at this time, we're sitting where the Sahara Desert is now. So it's desert conditions for most of the Triassic. Moving sand dunes leading to cross-bedding. But the Pangaea continent was beginning to break up, really. It was faulting and rifting and generally becoming a bit unstable. And latterly, the sea encroached north of Shropshire, bringing with it its salt. So this is where the salt beds, when the salt beds of Cheshire and Lancashire were laid down. Grinshill stone was laid down, which is the most important building stone in Shropshire. And by now we're 30 degrees north, so we're in the northern hemisphere. Next. These are some of the ubiquitous stones of North Shropshire. We live right on the edge of this. We're over the Permian sandstones, but nearby we have new red sandstone, the Triassic. So in our area, it's a very friable rock, very bedded, very sort of narrow beds, not very good for building stones, which is why West Felton Church is in such trouble. A little bit higher up, you get the Erdeston mine, which is actually a copper mine as well, I've talked about before, but it's a building stone quarry, and it's much more massive because we're in the line of where these sands were laid down in a different environment, which gave rise to much stronger rocks. At the bottom you see here is a bit of West Felton Church here, where you see all the erosion going on. And the Holyhead Road, Telford's famous A5 now. This is one of the bits that's been bypassed, but the walls he built, he chose this rock rather erroneously, and they are now eroding away and needing much repair. But where do you get it from? No one quarries it anymore, sadly. But here's a sort of a typical new red sandstone village at West Felton, Nestcliff. Then these houses seem to grow out of the hills behind. We've even got this one is called Quarry House. It was actually built in an old quarry. A Nesquith quarry, the famous quarry where Humphrey Kynaston hid and was a highwayman. It's a very, very large building stone quarry, disused now, but could be brought into use, I suppose, if needed. And here we come to the most famous Shropshire building stone, the Grinshill Quarry. Further along this line of hills, at just near Clive, we have the Grinshill Quarry, where, for reasons I don't quite understand, the rocks are not, in the main, are not red. It's something to do with how the sand is coated with ironstone. But it's this lovely honey-coloured rock, and it's a freestone. Although it's laid down in sedimentary form, it's worked in any direction and has been used for many a building in Shrewsbury and further afield, because it's recognised as a very good rock, and the quarry is still open. So there we are. Shrewsbury railway station is faced with Grinshill stone. The old market hall, which is very much older than the station, obviously, all built of Grinshill stone. There's Shrewsbury Old School. Above is the school, and below is a wall which is much more rubbly, much more using the red sandstones. And famously, the columns and plinth on 10 Downing Street are made of Grinshill stone. So we have Shropshire has two claims to fame at 10 Downing Street, in that dear Boris Johnson was married in West Felton, as it happens, to his first wife, who didn't last very long. And he stood between these two pillars where he also didn't last very long. Right, now I'm moving on to something. Rocks after that basically weren't laid down in Shropshire. We do have liassic rocks, but they don't form solid rocks, so weren't used. But another source of building stones and aggregates are the sands and gravels dumped by the ice ages. If you saw my last but one talk about the ice ages, you will know that Shropshire featured very highly, and a number of glaciers crossed Shropshire and left dumped their loads. So we have a number of very active working quarries exploiting these gravels. So we've got Wood Lane Quarry in Ellesmere, which has quarried its way through some very large moraines. This is where two lines of streams of glaciers converged at Ellesmere, and you will know what an amazing landscape that produced, but it produced a lot of gravels and sands. So Wood Lane Quarry, now a nature reserve where it's been worked out, about which more in a minute. Condover Quarry, which is literally a mile south of the Sharpstone Quarry, but couldn't be more different. Very much a sandstone sand quarry, where the famous Condover mammoth was fished out. Bromfield Quarry down near Ludlow, which seems to be very much a gravel quarry, still, I believe, working. So these are contribute enormously to Shropshire economy. Next. So this is a bit of a David Pannett summary of the building stones of Shropshire, which I won't go through again. But as you see, there are building stones of many ages, right from the Precambrian Uriconian volcanics to the boulder clays of the Pleistocene, many of which have been exploited for their building properties. Okay. And what you do? Well, this is just a recycling yard. If you have a house built from Shropshire and it falls down or bits fall down, you want to replace them. So latterly, I think in the last, say, 30 years, people have cottoned on to the fact that it's a good idea to recycle these features. So as you know, there are a number of recycling yards in Shropshire, which are a cornucopia of bits of old buildings. A wonderful place to go scavenging. Next. And what do you do with an old quarry? Well, this is a very important part of this talk, because old quarries can be, well, they literally are a scar on the landscape, but they're also a valuable resource. So on Wenlock Edge, I came across this company selling pallets and storing pallets in one of the old lime quarries. And to the right, as you come out of Shrewsbury Bypass, going south, up the turn off to, I think, to Bridge North, you will see a large number of caravans. And they are sitting pretty in what I think is an old quarry. I'm not absolutely sure, but it has a face atop by all these little huts. So it's a very good place to store and sell caravans. And I really do like this little whip on an adventure before dementia, which we're all on, I suppose. We are particularly. By now, you've probably realised that it's setting in. Anyway, other quarries. The famous Dingle, of course. Percy Thrower saw the potential of the old sandstone quarry in Shrewsbury Park and created this beautiful garden. On the right, we have Lannamonnock Quarry, which is a nature reserve now and grows, and where we all find all sorts of lime-loving plants, but it's also used at weekends by climbers. So these cliffs are often festooned with idiots climbing up with their strong nerves, fortunately on ropes, but I'm sure fatalities happen from time to time. It's also used by peregrine falcons, so it's a bird reserve as well. Bottom left, we have a house sitting in a quarry in middle. So you can build your house in there and it's nice and sheltered from all the winds. And Moor Quarry is very adventurous, and it is marketing its old quarry as a film location. If anyone can tell me what film has been shot here, I'd like to know, but that's a good way of marketing a derelict quarry. Nils Hill in Ponsford that I've built already. I've built Nils Hill. Is a nature reserve, and a lot of them have become nature reserves. They've just been allowed to go back to nature and are very, very rich in all sorts of plant life, bird life, mammal life. Paul's Coppice is a nature reserve, and the coppice bit is because there is a coppice there and it's being rejigged as we speak. Wood Lane Quarry, the gravel quarry, once it's worked out, it's been watered and is a very good nature reserve for wetland birds. But it's also a landfill, which is another important use for old quarries. We need landfills, sadly, because we lose all the geology when they're landfilled, but it's a good use, filling large holes. And my favourite quarry of all, the Dolgoch Quarry in the Oswestry Hills. Again, it's a nature reserve, but look at the beautiful. I go once a year. It's a little bit difficult to access because you have to go through a housing estate and a rather spooky wood from the south, but there is another walk from the north. But it grows these lovely bee orchids, butterfly orchids, and notably this fossil is a Gigantosaurus. Oh, take that thing away. Gigantoproductus. It's a very large brachiopod, which everything in the Carboniferous grew very, very large because there was a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, and it promoted a lot of these shelled beasties. So there we have Gigantoproductus. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll over to Charles now.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Sally, for that. What we didn't say at the beginning was that the original talk, the sound quality failed for a reason we haven't determined, really. So what you're listening to now is a a re-recording of the original talk. So thank you for listening. And as we said at the beginning, if you have enjoyed the talk, then do please consider donating via our website, and you can get in touch with us via that website as well. So they are www.cpreshropshire.org.uk, and that enables you to donate now or even to join us today. So thank you very much for listening. I will stop sharing now and end the recording.